Hi, thanks for having me. I really wish I could be there in person, but we're gonna have to do the second best thing today, which is talk remotely. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and join in this symposium. I really appreciate the kind invitation, Adriana, in particular. And so I hope to get to share some ideas with you today that I hope might be useful for some of you all in your own work. Um, you know where I work. I want to give you a little bit more background because it really informs the perspective that I've been sort of developing over the years that I'd like to share with you. Also, some provocations that I'd like to share with you today. As you mentioned, I've worked across a bunch of different places, including working as a professor, working as an industrial researcher at companies big and small, and now I'm at a startup. But actually, a lot of the ideas that have inspired me actually came from an internship that I did during grad school, and it was an internship that I wasn't really supposed to be doing. You do it in the summer, and it's so much fun that you stick around for 3 years. And that was at this kind of magical place called Xerox Park or Palo Alto Research Center. I'm talking to you from Santa Cruz, California today, which is not that far away from this place. But this has been, a journey. And I think along that journey, I've seen a whole bunch of robots and worked on a bunch of different robots as a researcher and as a consultant, and just helping friends out with trying to figure out, which direction they want to take their robotic product or service and company. So these, they range from robots that are more familiar to us, like service robots that might bring you some items at the hotel that you might be staying at in case you forgot your toothbrush, right? The front desk can send that robot up to your room and bring that extra toothbrush for you, to robots that might be in your home, helping with things like training your dog to behave a little bit better. There's also, of course, the autonomous vehicles on the roads. And I think things get really interesting when we look also in the sky, to things like delivery drones that might be bringing, for example, at Zipline, they do delivery of blood to remote medical facilities that need emergency supplies quickly. Also, robots in the ocean. The ocean, just like space, can be a very difficult place for our human bodies to go. And so it makes sense to try to use robotic technologies to enable us to go places that we couldn't otherwise go. Because, quite frankly, underwater we would get crushed, just like how in space we wouldn't be able to breathe. And so I see robotic technologies as an enabler for people to be able to do more than what we could do with the bodies that we were born with. Um, I think this might actually not be a very popular point of view right now. And so, just to put this in context, the media is currently obsessed with humanoids. They're very popular. But as all of those here know, right, if you've been working in AI or working in robotics, um, humanoids are not new. And this history goes back even further than the 1980s. And so I think the question, at least in my mind right now, is like, why now? While there are certainly interesting technical challenges to tackle with the development of humanoids, I think we need to ask some harder questions of ourselves too about what is the purpose of these robots? What are they for? Who are they for? Who are we expecting to be able to use these systems? What tasks are they really going to be able to perform? Just as some examples, right? For example, the DARPA Grand Challenge, that purpose was to help with emergency response at places like the Fukushima disaster, right? And I think there are places where these systems can make a lot of sense. Also in entertainment, if you are running Disneyland, for example, it can help to have animatronic actors in your space. But I think for other folks who are looking at places like putting these in the workplace, putting these in manufacturing facilities, we need to get more specific about what are they doing, who are they doing it for, are they worth the investment, and is the customer really going to feel like they're worth the hassle? The more you work with robots, the more you know they take a lot of maintenance. These days, there are full-time jobs that are called robot wranglers, right? And these are people who have the technical capabilities to keep systems like this up and running. And that is no small feat. So as we're thinking about, the context of these humanoid robots, I will say I'm guilty also of pursuing these sort of science fiction futures. And I worked on this robot called the PR2 or Personal Robot 2 that was really developed for robotics researchers. We were not at that time trying to develop a real sustainable business. And at Willow Garage, honestly, this robot was inspired by Rosie. This was the home robot from the Jetsons. And it was a lot of fun to work on the system. And it almost didn't feel like a job to me to get to work on it. And even though many of our robotics research friends loved this robot, it wasn't a product that people wanted in their homes. Plus, it costs about $500,000 US. So that doesn't make a viable business, right? You might have a market of a few billionaires, and that's about it. I think that our pop culture might be suffering from a failure of the imagination. I think, first of all, there's this problem of assuming that robots need to look like us. They don't. It's just easier to stick an actor or a dancer in a robot costume and as opposed to trying to be a little more creative. And I'm all in favor of bio-inspired robots, but that's not the same as straight up biomimicry and trying to make the exact same form that we come in. Second, I don't think that robots have to replace us. We've set up this false dichotomy of fully manual work versus fully automated work. And for many years, right, we've been hearing all of these predictions about a supposedly near robot future in which we have fully self-driving cars. That reality is not quite here yet. There's still many humans in the loop who monitor these self-driving cars and get them out of trouble when they get stuck. In fact, just a few months ago, one of these self-driving cars got into a lot of trouble when it got in the way of a neighborhood celebration in San Francisco. The crowd got a little frustrated with that robot that got in their way and got in the way of their celebrations, so they set the robotaxi on fire. It really doesn't have to be this way. I would argue that technology is only as good as people's desire to use it. And this picture in particular is missing some very important alternative futures that exist in the middle. You've heard about this from Guy already today. You've heard about this from many of the speakers, I'm sure, in this symposium. I just want to hammer this point home a little further, right? So in the case of self-driving cars, let's say, we've seen bits of robotic technologies making human driving better. So lane keeping assistance systems help people to drive safer. Adaptive cruise control makes it easier to drive long hauls. Parking assistance systems help even the worst drivers to perform better and to feel less stressed as they're doing it. And I think the important lesson for us to learn here is we can use bits of robotics to improve human performance and user experience that can provide more value to people so that they might even be willing to pay you for those robotic products and services. So I think the question at hand is how might we make robotics more like those driver's assistance systems? As one of my favorite computer scientists put it, who worked at Xerox PARC at the time, technology should fade into the background of awareness. It should be ready at hand, like a carpenter's trusty hammer. When the carpenter is hammering a nail, all he's thinking about is where to put the nail. He's not thinking about how to operate the hammer. He's not admiring the hammer's look and feel. It's invisible in use. This idea of making technology invisible in use was born mostly out of frustration with seeing people immerse themselves too much in their computers, spending a lot of time, for example, in virtual reality instead of in meat space, and paying attention to computers as opposed to paying attention to people and the world around them. And so at this point in time, if you'd like to read more about it, John Tinnell has an amazing book on this topic. This team of folks, back in the day, many decades ago, had this idea that maybe we should put computing into everyday objects. And so they embarked on this effort to put computing into whiteboards to support collaboration, putting computing into tabs, right? Which at that time was a bit like pagers, but these days, it might be more like your smartphone. And also to put computing into things that the form factor of a paper tablet. So think of it as, your iPad. And all of this predates those commercial products. But the basic idea here was that instead of putting computers between us this way, we could put computing around us in a way that we can leverage it to then work better with each other. It's kind of a beautiful vision. It is also imperfect. And of course, this way of shrinking and hiding technologies can be interesting, could be powerful, and it's fundamentally about how to make computing get out of the way. But as Weiser put it, I don't want to argue with my car about where I want to go. And we're seeing this now, right, with self-driving cars and figuring out how people are really going to interact with those. At Xerox PARC at the time, they had this artist in residence named Rich Gold, and he posed some really interesting probing questions about this idea of ubiquitous computing, as they called it. His question, among many others, was, how smart does your bed in your house have to be before you're afraid to go to bed at night? Right? So this all can backfire if it's not done thoughtfully, and maybe even if it is done thoughtfully. And I think as researchers, it's up to us to prototype and try things out and learn from those experiences so that we can push forward in more productive and positive design directions. When I got to intern at Xerox PARC when I was a grad student, there was a very common refrain that I'd hear there, which was that we were inventing the future. The future was not this thing that was just out in time. It was this thing that we were actively working towards, that we were shaping directly. And, these UbiComp experiments that were happening before I got there were happening when my mentor, Stu Card, was around. And he, you may have heard of him. He wrote the book called The Psychology of Human-Computer Interaction. He's an amazing person. And during the days of those ubiquitous computing projects, Stu and other researchers raised privacy concerns about putting sensors everywhere in their offices, monitoring people and where they were located, and how the computers might respond to them differently depending on where they were in the building. Many of them opted out of the experiments at Park. And so remember the tabs that they had, you could choose to not wear one. That was fine. I think even today, especially with our smartphones, we're grappling with these concerns about privacy and being monitored now. Stu, I think, had a really nice way of articulating the challenge that's in front of us. And Rich used this in the end of, his story about the plenitude, which is really largely about ubiquitous computing. And so he ends with this warning saying, how might we invent a future that we actually want to live in? And for me, this means, if we imagine a robotic future, how might we invent a robotic future that we might actually want to live in? Is it the humanoids? For some people, maybe, but for a lot of people, maybe not. These ideas actually came from a much longer and deeper philosophical history than the days of ubiquitous computing. And Mark Weiser drew inspiration directly from these and cited them in his famous 1991 Scientific American article. I think, one of the main inspirations came from Heidegger, talking about tools being ready at hand as opposed to present at hand. James Gibson, who's most famous for talking about affordances in psychology, also talked about this field of possible actions. And so if you're driving a sporty little car, that field of possible actions might look like a tongue that extends far in front of you and is very responsive to anything that might get in your way. As opposed to if you had a old jalopy of a car that doesn't move real fast and is hard to steer, that tongue might be shorter and chubbier and harder to maneuver, right? And so depending on what tool you're using, your field of possible actions could change. Michael Polanyi also talked about the proximal versus distal elements. And so he used the example of the blind man's cane. So if a blind man is using a walking stick, he's actually seeing the world through that stick. He's not just holding a stick in his hand and feeling vibrations on it. He's actually using it to perceive the world through it, which is different than a distal element. And Merleau-Ponty also talked about this as the maximum grasp, also using the blind man's cane as an example of making a tool feel like it's an extension of yourself. And I think these are kind of beautiful concepts that get towards the same idea of making tools more invisible in use for people to use to perform better. This was super inspiring to me. And I wanted to see if there were other tools that were like this in the current day, right? So you'll notice all of those tools, the hammer, the blind man's cane, the car, right? Those are very physical objects and physical tools. These days, cars have more computers in them. And so I decided to run a little study looking at asking people about their own experiences of tools that have become invisible in use. Based on those interviews, we then ran a larger scale survey to ask more people about tools that felt this way to them. So just want to take a moment and ask you, are there tools that come to mind for you? Ones that you feel like you forget you're using them when you're using them. But if they're not around, you kind of miss them a lot. I think one of those tools for me would actually be glasses. I have terrible vision, and when I'm not wearing glasses or contact lenses, I just can't see. But, as I walk around during the day and I've got my contact lenses in, I take them for granted and they're directly affecting the way that I can see and what I can do. I can drive a car safely, for example. Another example that we hear a lot about is, pens or writing utensils, forks, knives, chopsticks, those kinds of things. I think we thought were going to be the most common. Turns out that's not what we saw in our data. One of the things that really surprised me in these data were that many of these tools were actually computational. Of course, with the caveat that this was a small study done in Silicon Valley in California. So yes, it is a techie space. But 51 out of 132 of those had some kind of computer involved in them, which is a lot. 55 of them were purely mechanical, and kind of like those glasses, right? Only actually 38 of them were things that were worn on the body. So things that are physically closer to our bodies, I think, have a better chance of feeling like they're part of ourselves, which makes sense. I want to dig into this a little bit deeper. What makes these tools invisible in use includes things like being very reliable, being predictable and consistent, being familiar. For example, when you're driving a rental car as opposed to your own car at home, your own car is going to feel more invisible in use. You know where your corners are. You know how to parallel park it on a busy street. And I think a really interesting one is this last one, the sense of control. When something feels like it's out of control, or at least not in your control or in someone else's control, it is very visible to you because you need to grapple with it now. But when you feel like you have a maximal grasp over something, you are the one in control, it can feel much more invisible to you. Also surprising was that many of these tools were not comfortable and not that easy to use. As a former figure skater, I will say breaking in brand new figure skates can take over a year, and you will get a lot of blisters and there will be bleeding. It is not comfortable. Also, learning how to use a graphing calculator can be pretty hard. It takes time, but once you have mastered it, you've got a pretty powerful tool at your hand. So this, as someone who's worked in user experience research, I would have hoped that ease of use really mattered. Turns out, as long as they're willing to put in the practice and the time, it can become invisible in use, just, a great effort. When we asked about what it's like for these to become invisible in use, we heard words like, it's a part of me, it's second nature. And Guy here has done a ton of work on looking at fluency in human-robot interaction. And here they talked about very fluid motion, being effortless. And I think those are nice ways of using more colloquial language to talk about what it's like when something becomes a part of yourself. These things take practice, they take exposure, sometimes they take social pressure in order to get people to get used to doing these things. We forget often that it takes years to learn how to drive a car. And even though your car might feel invisible in use right now, when you were a teenager learning how to drive it for the first time, it did not feel invisible in use at all. And it just takes hours, right, of getting used to doing that. Also, trial and error can sometimes be worth it, right? So TV remotes are infamous for being terribly designed in terms of user experience. But once you get used to the one that you've got, right, it can become invisible in use. Not always. When things break down, they become visible again. And this isn't necessarily bad. So in ubiquitous computing, we talked about this in terms of seamful design. So instead of seamless design, where you can't really get down into the nitty-gritty details of how the system's working, when something does break down, you get a flat tire, it helps to be able to scrutinize what's happening so that you can actually fix the problem and understand what's wrong. I think also another really interesting one was that if you take the cell phone as an example, usually cell phones are seen as being invisible in use. But if you're waiting for an urgent call from your mom who's sick and might need to go to the hospital, suddenly that phone becomes very visible. You're very aware of it. You're going to make sure that it's got a good charge and it's got signal so that you can answer her call as soon as it comes in. So it's not about the object alone. It's also about the situation that surrounds it. I think there's a lot of insights that we could gain from this for thinking about making robots more invisible in use in a similar way to these tools. But, if you've worked on these robots that interact with people, you also know that they tend to be pretty interactive, right? They might even use language to talk with you. If it's a chatbot, it might be, chit-chatting away. And that's very different from thinking about, your glasses, say. I think this is what really pushed us in the direction of looking at other non-human agents that can become invisible in use. And the best example that we came up with at that time was horses. So if you're an equestrian, you understand this. If you're not an equestrian, it took, for like me, it took a little bit of time to get it. Um, we went and interviewed a horse whisperer and a few equestrians to understand for them what's it like when a horse becomes a part of their selves, right? When they can work together as a unit, not necessarily using language, not even necessarily using explicit body language, but how do they get things done together? And so this idea again of fluency is huge here. Um, we talked to the smaller sample of people because they're a harder group to find. But what was interesting was there's a difference here in the qualia, or what it feels like to be working together with the horse as if it's invisible in use. I'm not even sure we should be calling it use, but when you're working together in synchrony, it's more about being in harmony or being in the zone together. It's a Zen-like experience. I think, again, this is different, right, from thinking about the hammer or the blind man's cane or the glasses. It's more here about having effective communication, having practice together, and being more in harmony, getting in sync or getting in the zone with the horse. This one surprised me. Horses are great creatures, but it doesn't actually help for you to be really caring or giving snacks to your horse on the ground. Your relationship on the ground actually has very little to do with your relationship when you're riding together, which is not something that I was expecting to see. So here I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn. Of course, Kate Darling has talked about this, talking about robots as being a new breed, right? There are different species, let's say, that we're trying to learn to interact with. Even longer ago, Donna Haraway had a really great piece where she talked about the agility training that she does with her dog and the performances that they do together. And even though these are not human-like creatures, right, they are alive. And they do communicate with us in a different way than people might communicate with one another. And we can get work done together in pretty amazing ways, and in ways that we actually take advantage of our complementary skills with one another. So you could also think of, like, say, a hunting dog who can actually smell the prey in a way that we can't in order to show us where to go, right? So I think there's some really cool ideas here, and I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you one example of how we might apply these insights to a real robotic system. So, like I said, what if we designed these robots to work with people instead of just trying to replace them? And what if they were more like those horses that you can work with in tight synchrony? How might we design robots that make people's work lives better, easier, safer? I'd like to give you the example of just a push cart. They're everywhere, from retail stores to airports to hospitals. They increase our carrying capacity and they make it easier to move things over long distances. But there are some pain points with using them too. So let's take the example that should be familiar of just grocery shopping. So during your holiday break, you may have found yourself on a grocery shopping mission to help prepare a big meal. And that shopping list that you had might have been written by someone other than you, and you're going to a store that might be unfamiliar to you. Say you're visiting your parents. So how do you find the right items on those store shelves? And how do you navigate that grocery cart through crowded aisles of people? And after loading up your car with the groceries, do you actually return the cart to its proper parking area? Most importantly, how do you get in and out of the grocery store quickly without having to return to the grocery store again later because you picked up the wrong things? Now, let's crank that scenario up a notch, looking into the lives of warehouse workers. These are the folks who fulfill our ever-increasing demand for online orders. And instead of just shopping for one person with one list, how do you find items for a shopping list that's got dozens of people in it? How do you search a much larger set of shelves, fetching items whose locations might be changing every few days or even every few hours? And instead of dodging shoppers, now you've got to dodge forklifts and pallet jacks that are rolling through your workspace. Oh, and by the way, you might be doing these runs for 8 to 10 hours at a time, possibly during a night shift. So I think it's no wonder that people don't stick around in these jobs for very long. And in fact, there's a serious labor shortage in these fulfillment center operations. There's an increasing consumer demand for e-commerce goods, and the warehouse operators are struggling to keep up with them. So what are they doing about this shortage? There are two different approaches here. The first approach is to build a dark warehouse where, as they say, we don't need no stinking people. The warehouse is a robot. Actually, there might be a few human workers still remaining because they need to handle tasks that can't be automated yet, but we're going to automate them out of the system eventually. Those people are essentially being treated as cogs in a machine. The second approach is to operate more humane warehouses, providing better working conditions, tools, and opportunities for workers. And in our field research, I've met quite a few warehouse associates who've worked for their employers for well over a decade. They're proud of their work, they're creative in their problem solving, and they're resilient in the face of challenges. So, what does a good day at work look like for them? To find out, we conducted a diary study with over 70 warehouse workers and managers and then followed them up with 10 semi structured interviews. We learned that just like high performing athletes and musicians, it's about getting into a state of flow. It's about knocking out all the orders on time and working in smooth coordination with one another. So, how might we design robots to help people to keep in a state of flow? Well, we learned from their tools. When we asked warehouse associates about their favorite tools, the most common answer was that they loved the ride-on forklifts. And these forklifts, right, they help people to carry more, lift higher, and move faster. They make people superhuman. Another favorite tool was the trusty set of sharp box cutters. These enable people to do more faster and easier than what they could do with their hands alone. And like the carpenter's trusty hammer, they make people a little bit more superhuman too. So it's great to see tools that are empowering for pretty much everyone, but there's also some caveats there. We need to look at the tools that might be empowering for a few, but not maybe terrifying for others. The ride-on pallet jacks can make some people superhuman, but they can also become safety hazards for people who are left to walk on their own 2 feet. Those are the people who are dodging heavy machinery on the warehouse floor. And as one warehouse worker put it, she'd had to spend her day at work dodging the big yellow death machines. So, taking inspiration and lessons, hard-won lessons learned from good tools and caution from the other tools, how could we make robots more empowering and invisible in use? At Robust, we're developing a robot for warehouse workers, which we call Carter, because it's a cart first, and it's a robot second. Carter can drive through warehouses on its own, and it uses its cameras and visual SLAM to autonomously navigate through warehouse environments, but it can also be taken over by simply grabbing its handlebars. Push carts are everywhere in warehouses. I've visited facilities where they've used tens of thousands of push carts just in one building. And again, they enable people to carry more stuff and carry it further. And Carter builds upon these superhuman capabilities by adding a few bits of robotic capabilities to these familiar tools. Of course, warehouses are not unfamiliar with automation. More than a few of our study participants had seen other types of automation like conveyor belts, AGVs, and AMRs. Warehouses that use automation typically use conveyor belts or AGVs, autonomous ground vehicles, and they move like trains on a track. They're very strong and fast if you let them, but it's best to stand back when they're operating. Some warehouses are starting to use AMRs, or autonomous mobile robots, which can move around more like trucks as opposed to trains. They don't need the tracks anymore. And those warehouse robots are a little bit more like wolves. They're smart, pretty smart, they're strong, and they require special care and training to work with safely. I think it's time for us to start designing robots with more social skills so they can work with us more effectively. As a next step in this evolution, we're developing collaborative mobile robots that are designed to be more like working dogs. They're not only aware of people, but they're ready, willing, and able to work with us. So what do I mean by that? Here's just a few ways that Carter can be more responsive to people so they can work with it more effectively. All these examples I'm going to show you are real autonomous robot behaviors. They're not sped up and they're not teleoperated by people. So what if robots responded to commands and were as easy to use as a tablet? You can use Carter's touchscreen to just tell it where to go. Even when it's running around on its own, you can grab Carter by its handlebars to send it off to do a different task. And in that way, it's literally and figuratively ready at hand. And while it's efficient for robots to zoom around quickly with inanimate objects, doing that around people can be startling and potentially dangerous. So what if robots respected our personal spaces? On the left, you can see how Carter notices people and moves more cautiously around them, more respectfully around them. On the right, you can see how Carter moves quicker when it's squeezing by just a box. I would argue that for robots to work well with people, they need to be safe and they need to feel safe to work with too. To improve efficiency, Carter guides workers through a quicker route through the warehouse floor, pointing at where the next items are located. So it's a bit like a hunting dog in that way. Also, what if your robot could help you get out of trouble? Just as cars offer lane keeping assistance, Carter helps people to stay in their lanes to avoid getting in the way of oncoming traffic. And unlike regular push carts, Carter won't twist and turn when you want to drive it straight. And just as my car warns me about nearby obstacles when I'm parking, robots can help people to avoid warehouse accidents too. So in a moment, you'll see Carter being pushed on an aisle into a blind intersection. Carter sees the oncoming hazards and resists being pushed into them. These kinds of guardian behaviors can help to keep people and robots out of harm's way. Of course, you could also imagine a future in which humanoid robots eventually offer similar features. But how far away is that future? And how affordable are those robots going to be? The labor shortage in warehouses is a problem being faced today, and they need better solutions now. And I think those solutions are going to need to work better with people. People always find a way to push aside technologies that get in their way. When pizza delivery robots hog the sidewalk, people knock them over. When hospital delivery robots get in the way, the staff accidentally hit their kill switches and push them aside, or worse. And self-balancing robots that get in the way are going to get their balance tested. So I think it's critical for us to design robots that adapt to workplace norms, making people's work lives better, not worse. And when we make robots that steal the spotlight away from people, I think we shouldn't be surprised that people respond negatively. We have an opportunity to design a future where people are the stars of the show, and the supporting cast of characters could include robots, even if they don't look like Rosie. I hope this talk might offer you some ideas for alternative futures where robots are not necessarily a threat to people or to their jobs, but a future in which robots can be designed to fit better into our lives. My most optimistic vision of the future is one where robots become so approachable, useful, and usable that we might not even call them robots anymore. In the case of our work at Robust, I'm excited about robots that fit so well into warehouse environments that they end up hiding in plain sight, empowering people to be superhuman in new ways. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions that people have got here.
Not sure. So thank you, Leila, for this great talk. So any questions? Yeah, okay. Can we come here? Est-ce qu'on peut venir ici? Bon. Oui, bien. On ne peut pas parler? Ok. Tu peux taper. Ok.
I go there?
Ah. Ok. Okay.
Tu poses.
Je pense pas qu'elle entend. I don't think she can hear.
Okay. So I'll ask, and then there will be some lag. So thank you very much for this talk. Very interesting. Actually, I come from more the developmental cognitive robotics side, and so it's very interesting to see that also from the design and the human-robot interaction side, there are notions that are commonly used, especially Gibson's affordance theory or the flow theory. So I also work with the flow theory to see if robots can learn to use tools with intrinsic motivation. And so as you are trying to design tools that can be handled and be used easily as tools, my question is, from your perspective, when does an object become mastered and become an extension of the body map, let's say, and be easily used as a tool? And when does this, do you think this switch happen between learning how to use this tool and using this tool to build some more complex tasks. Thank you.
We have to resume it by typing because she cannot hear. So long. So not long.
I'm also happy to jump on a video call, or hopefully maybe after the Olympics, visit in Paris too. Okay, the question we've got is, as we're trying to design tools, when would you switch from learning how to use a tool to becoming able to use a tool? This is a deep question. I think that often I hear in the area of performance psychology, and thinking about in relation to flow theory and affordance theory. Nice. So I think, in relation to flow theory, there is a point at which you're a beginner, right? So you don't really know what you're doing. You're a novice. And so then you're going to be in this area of like the challenge is too high, right? And your skill is too low. I think over time, as you begin to master that tool, ideally you get into the flow zone, hopefully not all the way to boredom, right? And so you want to be in this space where your skill is increasing here over time. And so that flow zone can get bigger. And so you can handle more challenging tasks. I think that's where it would fit in flow theory. In terms of affordance theory, right? So thinking about Gibson and his notion of like, how do I know that a pen affords writing? How do I know that a chair affords sitting? I think as tools again become more familiar, as we get more practice with them, as we experience tools that are comparable to them, it becomes easier over time for us to see the possible uses for using those tools too. I think one of my favorite tasks to ask people to do in user studies is actually a creativity study where we ask people to look for alternative uses for objects. And so you might give them like, maybe a coffee mug, and think about all the other things you could do with it besides just drinking coffee, right? Maybe you could use it as a flower pot. And I think because as we expand our familiarity and our mastery of different types of tools in our environment, I think it expands your ability to be more creative with using those tools, but also more effective at it. And ideally, if we believe in flow theory, and it as difficult of a concept as that one is to like grasp and measure, I do think there could be a huge benefit in making robotic tools, or actually any tools, help us to get into that flow state and stay in that flow state so that we can do even more challenging tasks with them over time. My favorite work, at least my favorite empirical work in this space, is more in the performance psychology space. Another question coming in is, how do we know what are the acceptable social behaviors for a robot in a warehouse? Oh my gosh, that is a good question that we're grappling with right now. So our intern, who's visiting actually from Cornell in the same area that Guy's coming from, we are right now doing ethnographic field work with looking at carters being used in warehouses to understand what is appropriate and what is inappropriate behavior. It gets really complicated when, for example, everyone's rushing around, including the robot, in order to try to get work done together. Those crowded situations get pretty complex. And so our default stance is that the robot should defer to people, right? It should respect their personal space and give them the right of way. But there are times when actually the robot is on a more time critical mission. Maybe it's delivering the express items to the delivery dock, and the people are actually just working on stuff for the next day's set of orders. And so there may be times when the robot is going to need to be more assertive about taking right of way for the good of the team, not because it's being selfish. I can tell you about inappropriate behaviors around these robots because we have seen quite a bit of it. Talking with friends who have worked at other companies where they make autonomous mobile robots for warehouses, I have been warned, if the robot sees a forklift, you should run in the opposite direction, because they have watched many robot video logs from the sensors on the robots in which they see a forklift get near the robot. You can see the forklift driver look at the robot and then drive right into the robot, maybe knocking it over, right? And so inappropriate behaviors are abuse of those robots. But I think, the psychologist in me would actually prefer to get down to the root cause of like, why did they do that? Right? Why are they so frustrated with the robot that they feel like they need to stab it with the forklift? What's really going on so we can figure out how to make that better, if we can make that better. So I think we're pretty far from the future in which we really do understand how those social dynamics should be working. We've definitely seen different ways that they could be working, and they're not working very well right now, at least for AMRs that are currently on the market. So with Carter, we're hoping to do better, but we'll see, right? It's an empirical question. We're going to find out through the deployments with customers.
Another question.
Another question coming in is, how can we do a trade-off between social skills and safety? Ooh, that's interesting. Yeah, there might be times when, showing socially appropriate behavior might not be directly in line with what's safest, right? So if the robot is actually needing to take the right of way in order to improve the performance of the entire human and robot working team, it might move a little bit more assertively. And we need to make sure that we do that in a way that's as safe as it can possibly be for those workers. I think one way that we can do this, right, is good old-fashioned HRI, right, of signaling to people what you're going to do before you do it, right? And so Anka Dragon's done a lot of great work in this space at UC Berkeley, looking at how do you let people know through more legible robot behavior that it's going to grab the thing on the right versus the thing on the left. With mobile robots, we can do things like use turn signals. We can do things like feint a little bit to the right before you merge into that lane, right? And so I think there are good interactive behaviors that we can engage in to help people to predict what the robot's going to do next before it even does it. And I think, those kinds of design, the behavior design can help a lot here. Safety always needs to come first in these warehouses, I will say. That is the one metric that everybody brags about. I've been to warehouses where they have the number of days since the last safety incident. I've also heard stories about other robots in other warehouses where a robot may have run into a ladder, which then fell over and crushed a person. That's not okay, right? And so for us, safety is number one. And then using the socially appropriate behaviors to ideally improve safety and perceive safety so that people are safe and they feel safe. That's the holy grail for us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, you can hear. Okay, great. Thank you all. So this was the last session of today. Thank you, Leila. So I will let